Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I think we have everyone that we're gonna get. So let's get started. So thank you to everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. This is our third webinar of this academic year. My name is Patrick Rooney. I'm a third-year PhD in strategy at Rotman, a BEAR research coordinator, and the moderator for today's webinar. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BEAR, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way to hear firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insights, and in particular, behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. We're delighted today to have our first dual presenters, both from the World Bank, Zeina Afif, who is a senior social scientist, and Iman Sen, who is a research analyst. They will be talking to us today about understanding and reducing barriers to female labor force participation. Before I introduce Zeina and Iman, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speakers will deliver a 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the chat tab at the top right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. Actually, it's been changed to the bottom, so it's a bubble at the bottom of your WebEx screen. These questions that you enter will be visible to all of the participants, and at the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we'll have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the chat tab to ask our speaker. If you have any connectivity issues, please address Liz Kang in your chat message. Liz is our WebEx technical guru, and by including her name in your message, we can more easily separate questions for our speaker from those dealing with technical issues. So with all of that as a preamble, and with all of that aside, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Zeina Afif and Iman Sen. Zeina Afif is a senior social scientist with the Poverty and Equity Global Practice at the World Bank. Zeina is currently working on applying behavioral insights to improve women's access to finance and jobs, reduce youth unemployment, reduce gender-based violence, promote social cohesion, and improve access to public services and programs. Prior to joining the team, Zeina provided operational communication and behavioral insights support to World Bank projects and has worked in countries such as Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, and Yemen in the areas of taxes, social protection, social accountability, and citizen engagement. Zeina holds an MBA from George Washington University and a Master of Science in Behavioral Science from the London School of Economics. Iman Sen is a research analyst at the World Bank, working with projects on tax compliance, financial management, energy, and understanding social norms through the support of behavioral interventions. Prior to joining the World Bank, he worked on randomized evaluations in governance, energy, health, and gender in South Asia, in different capacities for innovations in poverty action and the Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Iman holds master's degrees in economics and computer science from New York University. Thank you both for being here today, and take it away.
Thanks for having us, Patrick, and very excited to be part of the webinar, and especially with this with the group. I'm gonna just quickly share my presentation. So, 1 second. Great. So Iman and I are part of the World Bank Behavioral Science team called Embed, which basically was established a couple of years ago. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background information about the work we've been doing in behavioral science at the World Bank. And then I'm going to talk about the area for discussion today, which are the barriers that women face to enter the labor market in the MENA region. And then Iman is going to share the study we've done in Jordan on understanding what are the gender norms towards the female labor force participation. And hopefully then we'll have a discussion and questions and answers. So for those who are familiar with the World Bank, flagship report called World Development Report, in 2015, the World Bank published a report on behavioral economics, and it was called World Development Report on Mind, Behavior, and Development. And the report basically puts a framework forward on how we explain behavioral economics within public policy. And the framework is based on, looks into how most policies have been basically are designed, and it basically takes into account that most policymakers usually assume that humans are rational actors, and that they will tend to carefully weigh all choices, consider all readily available information, and make individual decisions. And what the, sorry, just one second. Oh, here we go. And what we propose in the World Development Report is that most of us, actually all of us, most of the time have used basically, we think automatically, we tend to think fast and rely on mental shortcuts. We also think socially. We cooperate as long as others do the same, and we also rely on social networks and norms. And we also do not invent new concepts on how we make decisions, but we rely on mental models that are based on historical shared history, previous experiences. And these mental models tend to filter the way basically we interpret the world and we make decisions. So as you may know, today there's over 180 behavioral insight units around the world, and they're actually increasing. And our team, we are kind of like a startup right now, where we work with bank teams, but as well with government units, and then with donors on applying behavioral insights into projects. We are a team of 10 people. We have already 29 results. We've worked with 78 partners. We currently have 78 active projects in 65 countries. And we work in different areas, including effective organizations around environment issues, health issues, education, finance, security, as well as labor markets. And a couple of examples of our work, which you can find a lot of the research papers and the briefs on our website, is, for example, the intervention we've done in Peru on growth mindset, where we were able to increase education outcome equivalent of 4 additional months of schooling through the growth mindset intervention. And in Tanzania, by using social comparison and mental models, we're able to increase, in text messages, we're able to increase savings by 11%. And in Nigeria, we use social recognition programs to promote, to encourage accurate administrative work. And finally, in Poland, some of you may be familiar by now with the tax compliance intervention done in the UK and Guatemala. The intervention was replicated in Poland, and the interesting finding was that the peer comparison did not work. Instead, the hard tones were much more effective than the peer comparison. So this basically emphasizes how important context is when we're doing a lot of these interventions. So our work, we approach things, we're very much context driven. We spend a lot of time and resources in understanding defining the behavioral problem and doing diagnostics work, and understanding the problem from the user perspective or the beneficiary's perspective. We are evidence-based. We regularly test as much as we can, and we rely on previously tested interventions as well. And we do our work iteratively, so we adapt our interventions as we are learning and as we find more evidence. And this is just an example illustration of how we work and the cycle we go through. And as you can see, it's continuous. We try to learn as much as we can from our interventions and improve project design. So one of the areas where we are working on, which is one of the priority areas for the bank, is improving labor market, improving women economic empowerment in the Middle East, and more precisely looking into increasing female labor force participation, especially in the private sector. So some of you may know or may not know that MENA has the lowest female labor force participation of all the regions. And there's a lot of different gaps across all countries. And to give you an example here, so out of all the countries in MENA, you can see that Jordan is around 14%, and that's slightly increased from 1990. You have a country like you have Yemen, where actually it has been reduced to 6%. And you have also Lebanon, where there has been very small improvement up to 23%. So this is a big priority for the World Bank and the governments in the region. And we have been working with them to see how we can leverage behavioral insights to increase women's participation in the labor market. So women face multiple barriers to work in the constraints to work in the in the labor market. Some of them are legislatives. There are laws that prevent women working in certain industries. It also prevents women working at certain times, and not all of them are necessarily always applied, but they do give the message that these are restrictions that private sector companies can decide to apply. There's also regulatory constraints that there's also discriminatory practices. So a lot of the policies in the workplace aren't family friendly or friendly for towards gender issues, and a lot of it is also due to law enforcement. And then there are structural issues, including, for example, transportation, access for jobs that also affect women's ability to find jobs. And another one is societal, and this is where we start talking about the gender norm and the social norms that limit women's integration into the labor market. And another barrier is skills. They don't always necessarily have the skills for some of the jobs. There are sometimes mismatch in skill set towards the labor market. And then also psychological. So this is where the issues are more around self-efficacy, confidence, and job search intensity. And even though not all of these topics are necessarily behavioral topics, all of them, behavioral interventions can play an important role. And one of the projects we have right now, which we hope to share in the future, results from that Iman and I are working on, is how to address some of these issues at the legislative, at the private sector, basically addressing employer biases, as well as psychological, addressing the job search intensity, and finally understanding better the social norms. And we're doing this study right now and this pilot project in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So some of the way we've been applying behavioral insights in our projects to support this the women's economic empowerment agenda in the Middle East is in Oman. We did an intervention to see how we could motivate inactive women that were receiving cash transfers, financial assistance, to look for jobs. It was a short pilot that focused on basically motivating them and as well as goal setting to help them go through the experience of preparing their CV all the way to applying for jobs. And in Turkey, we are currently doing intervention where we're trying to address targeting employers to reduce gender stereotyping. And you're going to hear a little bit from Iman regarding the gender norm study we did in Jordan. And in Kurdistan, also, we've been doing this pilot project where we're targeting the legal, legislative, private sector, as well as psychological and the social norms level. And because of this pilot project that we've been working on in Kurdistan, now we have a larger program in all of Iraq where we're trying to mainstream basically the gender agenda and apply behavioral interventions across different areas, legislative again, as well as access to finance for SMEs and other areas. So with that, I'll turn to Iman, who's going to walk us through the study we've done in Jordan on measuring social norms.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Iman Sen, so Zainab and I have been working a lot on the Kurdistan projects recently. Unfortunately, We're still in the process of analyzing data, going through process reviews. So I'm gonna talk about a study we recently completed in Jordan, and it has basically two components to it. The first component was measurement. So like, can we or how can we accurately measure social norms, right? And then the second component is if we're able to successfully measure social norms and we measure multiple sets of norms across different themes, and then we can try to see which of these sets of norms are most binding. And that essentially can, help inform policy and provide more sort of grounded policy recommendations. So let's get started. What are social norms? Essentially, we describe it, there are multiple different definitions, but essentially it's a prescriptive, and this is important, it's an unwritten rule for behavior. So it's an unwritten rule which influences a lot of behavior, and common knowledge of the rule being accepted within a social group, right? So the rule is prevalent and followed within a social group. This is slightly different from moral rules, which are more sort of at the individual level, and then all the laws and regulations of the country as well. So historically, social norms have sort of developed from social interdependence and really helps with coordination and maintaining order. So I want to emphasize this point a little bit, is that it's mostly good. So if you think about your commute in the morning to work, whether you stand in line or not for a bus or a train, whether you let people off first, whether you say, whether you greet people, whether you say thank you, these are all like essentially, very helpful norms preventing, chaos otherwise, and just really helps us coordinate and maintain order. So that's an important point. But unfortunately, some harmful social norms have persisted over a long time. For example, female genital mutilation in Africa, open defecation in India, child marriage in South Asia and Africa, foot binding in China, etc. So these are kind of the harmful, societal norms that we worry about a little bit that might prevent people from opportunities. So part of this study was trying to measure social norms, accurately. So there's Jerry Mackey and others have looked at various definitions of what social norms are across different disciplines, and it turns out that there's roughly 3 to 4 common aspects when we're talking about social norms, right? When we're talking about measuring social norms in particular. So one aspect is that we need to it's constructed by one's beliefs about what others do. So this is what we call a descriptive or empirical norm. It's like what others, and I'll mention the reference group in a bit, but what others in a particular reference group are doing. Then the second component of that is what one believes about what others should do. So what one believes that others believe what the appropriate behavior is in that group, right? So these are two sort of, and this is the normative or injunctive component. So then, when you're thinking about expectations, we need to think about these two dimensions. What is what others are doing, and what is what others believe is the appropriate behavior. So then I just mentioned that reference groups are very important. When you're thinking about appropriate behavior at work, it's very different from what you're thinking about appropriate behavior with friends and family, for example. And the fourth sort of aspect is that social norms are maintained through approval or disapproval, and with different levels of severity. Okay, so now on to female labor force participation, MENA. As Zaina pointed out, the female labor force participation in Jordan is extremely low at 14%, even though women are increasingly more and more educated. So the study that we did will try to systematically measure norms, and I'll just talk about these different components in more detail in a second. The second part is we're going to try to ask about norms across a number of different domains. And so then that will tell us, which sort of domain is, social norms in which domain are most binding in terms of restricting female labor force participation. So in our team at Embed, the one thing I really like is that we always start with some sort of qualitative data collection, just talking to people on the ground. So because, as Zaina mentioned, everything is highly context specific. So when we did this in Jordan, there are 4 broad themes that emerge as to why women may not be working. So the first one is just general views on why, whether women are working. Sorry, 1 second. The percentage of women that work in Jordan, whether it's okay for women to work inside of the house only, or is it okay for them to go outside? The second broad theme was gender roles. So this is sort of traditional roles for women, stop working after marriage or after having children. Returning home by 5 p.m. was a topic that came up repeatedly, so that you can prepare your evening meals and so on. Leaving the child was generally frowned on, but the most acceptable form of childcare was leaving your child with relatives if you went out. And then there was sort of differing opinion on what the appropriate age was to leave your child and go out of the house and start working. The third broad theme that came up was essentially what happens when you leave the house. What are the risks there? So, is it okay for women to work in mixed gender workplaces? Is there a risk of harassment, like a greater risk for harassment for women? Does the reputation of the woman suffer? The fourth final category was that, what happens to the status of the household when there is a woman working in that household, right? What does it mean that the household is poor? Does it mean they're non-traditional? Does it mean that the husband is unable to provide? So there were these interesting, sort of broader status-related questions that came up as the fourth theme. All right, okay. So bear with me on this, and I'll keep repeating some of this information so that by the end of these 20 minutes, you'll be familiar with quite a few of these ideas. So when we're talking about social norms measurement, so what we did was we went back to, we came up with a bunch of questions across these themes, but for each question, we essentially asked at least 4 questions, right? So let's start with, do women work, right? So so first we asked about your own behavior. Do you work, right? So the next thing we asked about what women with the social empirical expectations, which is what women in your reference group typically do. So we're take a moment to think about the adult women where you live, right? So out of 10 such women, how many work outside their home? So in your reference group, what do women typically do in terms of working? And then let's focus on the social normative expectations. This is the injunctive thing. So we ask a similar question about, your reference group there is out of 10 such people, how many would think or speak badly about women who work outside their homes? So this is what what others in your reference group believe or would do, which is speaking badly if women start working. Right, so these are the 2 components that make up the social norms, is what others do and what others believe within your reference group. Then the next component is that what you believe, right? Is it okay? It's your personal beliefs. Is it okay for women to work outside of their homes? And then the final component, I understand this is complicated enough already, but we also wanted to ask about women's expectations about their spouse's beliefs, right? So either husband, father, or brother, to see if that was more binding. So essentially, what we're doing is we are trying to see which set of beliefs are most binding here, right? Is it at the individual level for the woman herself? Is it within a household level for women and her spouse or father or brother, like a male individual within the household? So is it at that household level, or is it at a broader societal level? So is it, what we call social norms? Is it what like others in your sort of reference group are doing, or what others in your reference group believe is the right or appropriate action? Okay, the only takeaway from this slide is that, you see the 4 themes on there, and within each theme, we asked a bunch of questions. So I think the takeaway is we asked way too many questions. And not only do we ask about, women, various questions about women working in general, gender roles, publicness and mixed-in status, but we sort of try to get these different perspectives as well. Like, what do others in your reference group believe and do, and what do you do and believe, and what your spouse doesn't, what your spouse believes, and so on. So, so we asked a lot of questions. So what was our sample? Very briefly, we talked to both men and women. And we surveyed in 3 urban areas in Jordan. Our sample size was about 2,000, and that was roughly half between women and men. We talked to a lot of couples. We tried to talk to as many couples as possible, because then not only do you get the woman's perception of their spouse's views, but you get the actual views of the spouse. And you can compare that. So we talked to a lot of couples, and we tried to like oversample working women, because the question is, are like social norms different for working women? How have they sort of overcome some of these constraints? Okay, I'm going to go through very quickly on the descriptive findings and some regression results. This is going to be a lot of numbers, but and so I'm going to go through this quickly, but I'm going to summarize all the information right at the end. Okay, so the first place you have to start by is asking whether women want to work, right? I mean, so, that's the first question that you need to ask. And so it could just be that women are not working because they don't want to work, right? But that is not the case. What we find is that 60% of non-working women say they want to work. So, effort is a little lower in terms of finding work, looking for work rather, but definitely most women want to work. Okay, these responses are a little more predictable. Why do women work? And then the general perception out there is it's because of financial reasons. Why do women not work? And this is where the traditional reasons seem to be more prominent, in terms of taking care of children, household, discouraged from working by husband. You see a little bit more of this, little bit of the structural barriers here in terms of cannot find jobs or no good opportunities. Why do women stop working? This is, mostly again driven by marriage and children. There is a little bit of structural reasons here in terms of jobs becoming too stressful or the woman being laid off. Okay, I'm going to summarize this slide very, very briefly. This is the first line, which is highlighted, is the question of like, out of 10 women in your reference group who live nearby, basically, how many work, right? And what we did was look at the responses separately by these four groups: working women, non-working women, men with working women partners, and men with non-working partners, right? And then what you see consistently across the board is that, working women have the most, have the most liberal attitudes when it comes to women working, which is as expected. And similarly, men with non-working women partners, spouses, have the most conservative views. So they always know the fewest number of women who work, or the most number of people who will think badly of women who work, and so on. So they always have the most conservative views. So this is not groundbreaking, but what this is saying is that we are capturing this variation in this, new social norms measurement framework, where the results are roughly as we expect it to be. Similarly, we did this for social normative expectations, which is basically what others in your reference group think or believe. Okay, so just to show you this, if you focus on the second picture, what we did is, because we have like so many different questions across the four themes, what we did is we just sort of aggregated everything and standardized it. And so the picture on the right shows you this aggregated difference between the two groups that have the most divergent views. So the blue distribution is from working women, and the red distribution is for men with non-working counterparts, right? And so you can see that we're measuring like a difference between these two distributions, because, again, like the higher responses over here means more liberal attitudes. And so working women have more liberal attitudes here, and men with non-working counterparts have the most conservative attitudes. And essentially, we can see a difference in their distributions across social norms questions, across personal beliefs, and so on. So we're capturing some of these differences. Okay, I will skip the slide on reliability and validity. This is just to say that whenever we measure a number of questions, for a particular theme, we need to do like factor analysis and look at the reliability and validity of these different indices, because you have a number of questions trying to measure a latent construct. Okay. So this is the second piece of the study, where now that hopefully I've convinced you we measured social norms in a somewhat meaningful way, which shows some variation. The question is now, which norms are most binding? So we measured across these four themes, and so the question is, what do we see here? I will only talk about one regression, and let me just briefly tell you the dependent variable here is whether the woman is working or not. And on the independent variables here on the right-hand side are the components that we've been talking about. Your social empirical expectations, what do others do? Your social normative expectations, what do others believe? What your personal beliefs are, and what your expectations of your spouse's beliefs are. So if we throw all of this, again, we can test which of these are actually more binding. Is it the societal expectations? Is it your own, or is it your spouse's, right? All right. So here are the regressions. Let me just very briefly say one or two things, and then I'll summarize the results in the next slide and in the policy recommendations. So what this shows is, so remember we asked about four themes, whether, about working women in general, about, the sort of threats or risks of going to work outside the house, the publicness and mixing aspect. That's column 3. Gender roles is column 4. Again, like coming back home by a certain time, taking care of your child until he or she's a certain age. And then the 5th column is status, right? Like what happens to your household, if there's a working woman, what's the perception? So what we find here, broadly speaking, is when it comes to views of working women in general and about gender roles, so columns 2 and 4, we find that social empirical expectations matter. So essentially what others are doing seem to matter. What others think don't seem to matter that much. But at the same time, along with that, what your beliefs are and what your expectations of your spouse's beliefs are also matter in these cases. Now, if we look at the publicness and mixing questions and the status questions, there it seems like the decisions are more within the household. So there it's only personal beliefs and your expectations of what your spouse thinks that seem to matter. What other people are doing or thinking outside don't seem to matter that much. Okay, I'm gonna skip this slide. And so let me just quickly summarize the results. So what we find is what we just said is that, we tested a bunch of different sets of social norms here. And what we find is that, at the end of the day, gender roles seem to be very important when it comes to like what people outside the house are doing, what people in your reference group outside the house are doing. When it comes to publicness and mixing and status, it's more of an intra-household decision. In other regressions, we find that the views of men are very important, which is also pretty much as expected. And so what are some of the policy implications of this is that now when we're thinking of social norms, we have a sense of what's the most binding set of social norms. And the results from this study suggest that it's essentially gender roles, like traditional role of the women, taking care of the child, being at home, to be able to prepare meals and other things. And so what this would suggest is just, focus on, and if we want to increase female labor force participation, just focus on policies such as, flexible working hours, so that, women are able to return home earlier, better access to childcare, and so on. Zaina briefly mentioned that we're also trying a competition with firms in Kurdistan. This is a competition to basically improve, making the workplace as female friendly as possible. And finally, what the role of men appear to be very important in different sets of results that I didn't really show you today. So one way one thing that has been tried in order to change mental models of men is like soap operas, different forms of edutainment, which essentially show, how working women or families, households with working women are coping with it. What are some of the positives from that experience for not just the woman, but for everyone else in the household? Okay, great. So I will stop there and look forward to answering some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you both for a really interesting presentation of a very important and novel research topic. So the question and answer session is going to begin now. So for those that are interested, please enter your questions in the chat tab. And I will just begin right now. So what first question is, apart from spousal work status, what other determinants or what other covariates might have led to differences in social norms? So, oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay, I'll speak up a bit.
Yes.
What other covariates might have led to differences in attitudes or social norms? So what I was particularly interested in is maybe there might be interesting variation in number of children that the family had, religiosity, politics, things like that.
Yeah, we've looked at that a little bit. One interesting variable over there that sticks out is what if the spouse has been exposed to working women. So if the mother of the spouse worked, So that turned out to be a strong sort of predictor as well. Other than that, yes, definitely. Specifically, having children under 5 was very binding. Again, because of lack of both in terms of it's being the role of mothers to take care of young children first, and secondly, the lack of access to childcare options. The other things that I can think of, there was some variation in terms. There was also geographic variation. So it turns out to be that Amman, which is the bigger city, has more conservative norms compared to Zarqa and Mafraq. So this we're not like 100% sure as to why that's the case. It might be that it's a bigger city. It might be the dangers of women going outside the home may be higher, or the dangers of exploitation may be higher, and so on. So we're not quite sure about that. But those sort of roughly stick out a little bit in terms of explaining that.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. So the second question, I think, is a pretty broad question. So feel free to take as much time as you want on this one. What aspects of social norms might be easiest or hardest to change? If we want to change them in the first place, let's say.
Sorry, Zaina. Okay, should I take a stab at it first, and you can?
Yeah, take a stab, and then maybe mention the Betsy, Rwanda experiment on the edutainment.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this is a whole different topic of changing social norms, right? So it really depends, to me, in my mind. So there are things that have been tried elsewhere, which is a sort of the disconnect, but there's sort of incorrect expectations of what the actual norm is out there. So if you severely, for example, underestimate the number of women who are working, then if you subsequently can update, have an intervention that helps to update those beliefs for people. So that has been like a somewhat easier intervention to try out to like change behavior eventually. It's just in terms of updating your expectations of the social norms out there, if there is a disconnect. So that's like a large sort of category of interventions that have been tried, and from open defecation to taxes to like sort of update these expectations and beliefs. So that's one way of how social norms changes occur. The second idea is very related. It's called pluralistic ignorance. It's somewhat very related. It's like a disconnect between your own personal beliefs, if they're more liberal, and if your expectations of what happens in society is more conservative, then if everyone themselves have liberal views, then if you tell people that, then it's again like then there can be a sea change. So those are some quick examples, and there's a lot of literature that's shown out there. I think in terms of, I'll just give you another slightly nuanced answer, which may or may not make too much sense, but it also depends on the interdependence. So how interdependent is this norm, makes it harder or easier to change it. So for example, if you take something like child marriage, where a lot, or like open defecation, where a lot of people have to coordinate and change the norm at the same time, then that's obviously obviously harder versus, let's say we take up like a, we're thinking about take up of a nutrition package. Then you can have incremental changes as let's say different caregivers or mothers take that package up slowly. So it's also like depends on how many people have to change their behaviors at one point in time. So that makes it harder or easier to change norms. But in the literature, what we find is that really a lot of interventions that are updating these different expectations, whether it's views of society or views of your spouse and so on and so forth. So I'll just stop there and let Zaina chime in with other things.
I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Iman, for that. That's very nuanced, and yeah, it's a very tough question. I mean, I think that's a huge question that a lot of behavioral scientists are always thinking about.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess kind of another question, and this might be the final question, depending on if we get other ones. But what's next, right? So how do we build off of this study to potentially learn more about social norms, influence policy, those kind of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, Zaina, did you want to respond?
Go ahead, Iman. That's okay.
Okay. Yes. So I think a broad part of this, the piece in Jordan, was to see if we could measure social norms accurately and try to get a sense of which norms are binding as well. So one thing that you can do is, again, like that in and of itself, in terms of which norms are most binding, informs which policies to tackle first. Right, and in particular, I was trying to emphasize the gender roles set of norms. So that's one way of looking at it. The other thing that we really want to do, and which would make it more complete, is to essentially then have interventions and evaluations. So like you really want to measure norms at baseline, do an intervention that supposedly changes those norms, and then measure both norms outcomes as well as the behaviors that we want to change, behavior outcomes at endline. So there's a really nice example of this work by some professors at U Chicago, in Saudi Arabia. It was a smaller experiment, but what they basically did was like they asked men about what other men think about their spouses working, and men severely underestimated how much other men think, to what extent other men sort of approve of spouses working. And so they subsequently updated the beliefs for some men and not for others about sort of approval towards spouses working. And then they found that for the men for who they had this updating belief treatment, then later on signed up their spouses for work at for employment opportunities at a jobs agency or something. So it's a really nice new paper, and it's an experiment. So I think, broadly speaking, we want to taking it to the next level. We want to not only measure norms, we want to have interventions that try to change these norms, and then we observe if norms have changed, if behaviors have changed, and we really want to measure real world outcomes in terms of basically seeing if women essentially sign up for jobs through various different agencies and are working down the line. So I think we want to definitely push to take it to that level next.
To add to what Iman is saying is we're now replicating the study in the Kurdistan region in Iraq. We're actually in the process of analyzing the results now. And what we plan to do in Iraq is to, based on how the study goes in the Kurdistan region, to look into it for greater Iraq. And what we plan to do is use, once we understand better which are the social norms that are binding and not binding, we'll have a clearer idea is if we're going to basically talk about legislative reforms, and we're going to talk about targeting, basically encouraging households to be okay with women working in the private sector. This will give us the insights to know who to target first, which beliefs we should be trying to shift, and what kind of how do we approach the conversation around the legislative reforms. So if there's going to be any new laws that we need to reform, how do we frame the messages, how do we and who do we target to as we discuss these new legal reforms. So that's how we plan on using it in Kurdistan, and then not just at the society level, but we will also look into it if we want to encourage women to, like Iman said, to basically apply for jobs. Then, and if we need to target men, then we would do the intervention targeting men, not just targeting or the parents or targeting the women. So that helps us really design an intervention based on where we think the bottlenecks are for increasing women's participation.
Fantastic. Yeah, that sounds very exciting and almost worthy of another BEAR webinar in the future. So we are super excited to see how all of that turns out. But again, so thank you so much for Zaina and Iman for leading our webinar today. For all of our participants, a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking on the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub-tab labeled BEAR Webinar Series. So for those of you who are interested and available, our next webinar will be December 6th, and we will hear from Carrie Morwedge, who is a professor of marketing at Boston University, who studies judgment decision-making. It promises to be a really interesting discussion, and we hope you all can join us. For all of you here today, thanks so much for attending. Thanks again, Zaina and Iman, for leading. Whenever you're ready, you can now exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen. Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.